Hello everyone, today we talk about the crisis of Italian communal institutions during essentially the 14th century, even a bit before, during the end of the 13th. Um, it's a really big process and also a very complex one and long, because every city-state had actually its own story relatively to this. There can be no easy comparison, but generally speaking there are certain dynamics, certain characteristics that really allow to identify this phenomenon on a structural level. Without too many premises, because this is really a topic I could discuss for videos and videos, since it's what I can't say expert on, but let's say the background to which I'm carrying out part of my studies at this moment, and it's a very complicated story. It is something that, by the way, it's not really perceived, I think, in medieval studies much abroad, nor in popular culture, but instead it is something terribly important, because there are so many strange and surprising characteristics of this phenomenon. Partly I've been discussing them in the in my video about the origin of Italian regional states. Essentially the paradox that when Italy was left alone, let's say, by the great German, French, and Papal powers, it started to not to remain in chaos, on the contrary, but really structuring by itself more compact domains. And this really started from the crisis of the communal institutions. It was something that really passed through it, because it was evidently sensed that there had to be a common guide, at least to certain political and geographical ensembles that were slowly structuring themselves, chiefly through the rise of lordship. So the crisis of communal institutions goes in parallel with the rise of the signories, and therefore the creation of more compact and centralized domains, with a chief and a ruler. Of the many paradoxes that we will be seeing relatively to this period is that the signories actually were born not through an imposition by the same lords over the citizenry, but the other way around. I mean, it was the same citizens that practically called for a guide that obviously wasn't perceived as an extremely positive thing. It was something that was done in conditions of emergency. Actually, many times in history, like if you take, I don't know, the ancient Germanic tribes, that they were absolutely egalitarian in their ideals and all, but when war broke out, a chief was necessary, so that the divided clans couldn't achieve much individually, but all together and necessarily commanded by someone could face the enemy. Same goes with the feudal era. With the feudal era, the feudal lords are chosen theoretically by the local communities to provide protection, for him to give them, to offer them protection, and getting something in turn in terms of services of some kind for maintaining the lord's troops and all. So in communal Italy, it really happened in the same way. And today we're gonna essentially look at chiefly the causes why this happened, and also partly of how this happened, without getting into much detail into the single city that perhaps, at least for the main Italian cities, I will do in the future. So, first of all, we start from, let's say, the mid of the 13th century, which is the moment of glory of the Italian communes, because it is the moment into which Frederick II dies, died, and he basically and the whole, let's say, imperial authority in Italy begins to vanish. There are still very harsh wars, telling the truth, backed by the Germans in Italy. That, however, because the Hohenstaufen are still in the Kingdom of Sicily, at a certain point, the Pope calls renowningly for the crusade against Manfred, son of Frederick, and the Angevins, led by Charles Vanjou, defeat both Manfred's and Conradin's armies in Italy, and he seizes the southern kingdom. And at this point, practically the Angevins are able to extend their hegemony all over Italy, but this went in parallel with a less direct intervention into political matters. The Germans, the Swabians, had tried really to reclaim Italy, also in terms of politics and local administration management. This had been part of the reason why the Italians had eventually rebelled against the Swabians, including the ones who initially sided with them, because they realized that the Swabian intervention would have been um, too too deep in their affairs, and they essentially and the Swabians in this failed partly also because they weren't able to co-opt the Italian um, um, ruling classes into the construction of their empire. This is a very an oversimplified version of what happened, because in Italy there were still people who were siding with the empire, the so-called Ghibellines, but there were relatively a few, and they were really struggling. But generally speaking, this withdrawal of the Germans, at least a temporary one, because at the beginning of the 14th century there is a revival, which is not so strong like the Swabian one, but that actually changed especially the political geography of Italy, because eventually most of northern Italy was brought under Ghibelline rule, differently from previous times. But this is not really important. Important it is that when the Swabians lose their grip on Italy, uh, it is the great victory of the Italian communes as city-states, as mercantile republics, and the central and northern Italy lived this moment of extraordinary economical prosperity. The That, however, went in parallel progressively with a very serious political instability. The reason of this is that the fate of the Swabians had been tied, in this sense, to a sort of feudal structure that the Swabians were embodying as Holy Roman emperors, so being at the top of the feudal hierarchy, by playing with the local Italian feudal lords that definitely still existed into Italy, even if the cities had really overexpanded, even at the expenses of the same lords. It's even difficult. Even here, we need to oversimplify, because actually these feudal lords weren't something detached from the cities themselves. Because actually the Italian city-states were born not through the by the commoners. I mean, the city-state wasn't a bunch of commoners, merchants, and who decided to create a city and to rule there on their own. Actually, the Italian city-states, like most of the other European communes, were born with the by the effort of the knightly class that were often urbanized feudal lords that ruled for a very long time the same city affairs, and that still at this point was very prominent into the political and social life of the city. So the loss um, the of the Swabian control over Italy brought the commoner class, the so-called popular classes, to get rid of these so-called grandi in Italian, which means the big ones essentially, or magnati, are the magnates. I don't know how you say that in English. It I'm gonna check it out. The magnate, yes, the tycoon. Just to be in contemporary terms, and they it's not that they really expelled them all from the city government, but basically they stamped and hampered their political influence by excluding them from the government in practice. So this was at the beginning the political triumph of the popular classes of the so-called popolo. mm, um, but at the same time, it was soon evident that um, the Pablo was not good at ruling. mm. The First of all, there is this contradiction for which certain political, um, telling the truth. Well, okay, maybe I'll say that later. Just I clarify certain concept now because they're important. When the popular classes got rid partially of these magnates, um, they got in practically in full charge of the situation of the cities. Now the magnates were knightly class, so there were people who were very well, extremely versed in warfare. There were knights in the full sense of the word. I mean, there is no difference between an Italian knight, a French knight, or German knight, a Spanish knight, even though they all came in different fashions. Like the Italian knight is a urbanized knight. The German knight is by right a non-freeman. I mean, there are all these difference in Europe telling the truth relatively to the political and social status of knights, but in terms of military affairs and lifestyle, they were all the same military elite essentially. So one of the characteristics of popular classes instead had been that they were chiefly commoners that didn't make their lives by through fighting to the craft of arms. They didn't care about warfare in the first place. They were craftsmen. They were traders. All they cared about was essentially to make money without problems and possibly expanding the commune's influence on the surrounding countryside, but really just in productive terms. I mean, they didn't care to overexpand their commune towards another city district, or at least this was possible, but usually happened on a very large scale. Maybe it was about trying to, every once in a while, to take one little castle of the tens, or if not hundreds, that existed in every city district. Maybe to I don't know, to reinforce the trade route by acquiring a particular strategic point of domination over a certain area, but it wasn't at all a massive involvement in warfare. The knightly class instead had been traditionally speaking all about war, and they had been trying essentially to conquer also. It's not really to conquer other cities, but at least to expand their hegemony over them by continuous raids or damaging the district economy, and actually organizing, even as nobles, their large estates relatively to their production. And this was all very intermingled. We can't cover it really now, but the real problem is that the popular classes didn't know how to fight, and incidentally, warfare in Italy had not stopped at all. Especially at the beginning of the 14th century, it was revived very strongly, especially because the Germans came back into Italy fighting against the Angevins and in this sense reshaping the whole political balance of the peninsula with very inconclusive warfare, by the way, at least from their perspective. So really engulfing the um, central and northern Italian lands once again into this prolonged struggle that combined the broad universal ambitions of the empire and of the Angevins with the local Italian rivalries and the rise of seigneuries and all. And one reason for which the seigneuries actually came into action, let's say, is that the popular classes into this completely messy situation into which they were very often defeated because they were just able at producing lots of poorly trained infantrymen that weren't really forced to underestimate, because really Italian infantries were pretty strong at this time. But it was the aside from the tactical provinces, it was the whole political and military sphere that the popular classes were extremely clumsy at managing. Think about the logistical. I mean, they needed someone who led actively the city in military terms. And therefore, the popular classes began to re-elect military chiefs that were incidentally most of the times of the same magnate social status, or at least partly those same families that had been kicked out of the urban affairs, the communal life, and that it came back from the countryside, offering their own service for the cities, in turn trying, however, to extend once again their power into the city, and especially creating sober city dominions that initially very trembling eventually began to grow more rooted and eventually giving birth to the seigneurial regional states. I made a video you can check out in the Medieval Italy playlist that is called The First Italian Lordships, Ezzelino da Romano, Berto Pallavicino and William VII of Montferrat, that actually talks about that in a fair amount of detail, especially about the second half of the 13th century. Today we give a more atemporal dimension of the explanation of the phenomenon, say, and however, these dynamics were overcomplicated also by other factors. First of all, all the legislation that the Popolo had produced in an anti-magnate function had been largely inadequate. First of all, certain magnate families were too strong, too big, and they couldn't, too wealthy, too famous, too powerful, and especially connected with so many other friends outside of the urban environment, including other rural lords or even emperors or kings and stuff, that to be really marginated by from the city government and influence. Furthermore, the anti-magnate legislation really wasn't defined scientifically, let's say, who the magnates really were. And the magnate is, even in sources, it's not very easy to understand, because normally the Popolo made these laws aimed at targeting one particular family, one particular milieu, entourage, as you want to call it, that was causing problems at the time. And usually behind these anti-magnate legislations, there were always other magnates. I mean, very rarely the people was fully autonomous in its political decision from other nobiliar families. Think of the nobiliar families that had ruled the communes up to the mid of the 13th century. Um, um, had been they were sometimes struggling with the popular with the commoners, but most of the times they were also clashing against each other, and the popular classes sometimes split into various parties siding with this or that magnate. So you understand how this truly complicate it is. Um, and the, uh, the magnate, just to give a broad definition, was usually uh, were usually the people who boasted the title of knight, and that therefore um, had a sort of noble nobiliar lifestyle, and who usually possessed I don't know, house towers into the cities and lands into the countryside. This is a pretty broad, probably fitting definition. But none of these characteristics actually corresponded to a precise socioeconomical level. Because there were families of nobiliar, magnate condition, let's say, that however were didn't have really a lot of economical capabilities, while there were families of popular families that instead uh, had, thanks to their wealth, maybe accumulated by trade through international relations and all, led a noble lifestyle in practice. So the whole thing is, and there wasn't in this sense a great hypocrisy regarding this, because everybody was fearing whoever was at the top. So it's not that necessarily the popular classes were in this sense favoring their own magnates while kicking out the just the knights. The political and social intersections were so deep and strong that um, you should really consider case by case in every city, and even in here it's extremely complicated, so we can't do that. However, and by the way, consider that being a knight, a magnate, had really a sensual base into Italy. I mean, most of these nobles really didn't belong to the ancient nobility of Europe. You know, the one descending from Charlemagne, ideally. Actually, this time, even in feudal countries, a very few people could boast such ancient roots. But in Italy, in particular, the nobles basically were people who had risen from literally from nothingness to that social status, so to that social status in a very short time. Like if you take especially especially stronger popular communes, like I don't know, the ones of Tuscany and Florence, for instance, you understand that most of these people had risen by making, not really by owning a big deal of land, of having this knightly feudal tradition, but maybe practicing usury, for instance, or being involved in business in general, and just having reached that position through money and not through any other mean. In fact, actually, the privileged interlocutors with imperial authority had been usually those more ancient families of feudal origin that had a stronger, especially stronger international relations since a lot of time, for a lot of time, because they had been at least invested by the public imperial authority of certain fiefs, and having managed certain mm, regions or provinces of Italy in the name of superior government before the cities actually took power into those areas. Um, so the the whole idea of excluding radically the nobles from the city government soon came to end, and it soon came to end also because the popular classes that were ruling the cities at this point were starting to be divided. They were extremely wealthy. They could carry out certain policies on their own. Um, they definitely had their military strength. So at that point, there were certain clashes for which the same Popolo called for certain mm, masters to bring an end to the struggles and to pacify, theoretically. Um, so there was this very elaborate system of exclusions and reintegrations into public life, depending really on the local influences that were literally infinite, because um, the political life in this city-state was continuously altered by international, regional, and local scale events. There was no stability. The political instability is a macroscopical datum of the late communal age, really, as almost as a genetic character. And the there was also another problem relatively to the that has to do. Excuse me, I drink just a little before I pass to the next topic. Um, Relatively to this, there is another process taking place, especially from the end of the 13th and the first half of the 14th century, before the Black Death that eventually really changed much more deeply the face of Europe. That there was an economical crisis, or at least a stagnation, in certain cases, even open recession into European economy. And the Italian city-states sometimes were the ones who could react better, but at the same time had the greatest upheavals, because most of the European economy was actually based on the Italian business. Um, and most of the feudal states of Europe at this time um, were financed by Italian bankers, by the loans of chiefly the Tuscans, but also the Lombards partly, the Genoese and all, to finance their own wars. So when open crisis began to happen in certain cases, I made a video about the Great Famine of 13, 15, 17. That was a really big thing that caused a terrible crisis through a domino effect, chiefly in the to the banking sectors. So you can better understand what I'm talking about. There was a great, it definitely increased political instability, but it also increased social inequality. And this social inequality was reflected into the communal life through the increasing impoverishment of the popular classes, and the rise of only a very few popular, the so-called fat populars, so-called the grassi in Italian, which means the fat citizens, literally meaning the the wealthy ones. There was an emergence of this popular elite, we can say, that tended to actually come close, very similar to the magnate class, also in lifestyle, as we were saying before. So, and this included partly the fact that certain wealthy, popular families married with decayed mm, um, feudal families, so creating ties that were, in this sense, extending also beyond the communal life. So there was never an end to the influences that the magnate class could really have on the people. In parallel to this, the popular classes declined also in military terms, because as long as the popular was relatively well off as a middle class, it was wealthy, there was not a great social inequality, it could field actually pretty strong infantries that never made it in Italy to actually autonomize themselves from the knightly cavalry, but that definitely were crucial to win some major victories of in the military events of the period, and that had definitely a very heavy political weight. Not much, perhaps, because of their open field capabilities, where, as we have said, cavalry was usually still the determining factor, and definitely the decisive one, but especially into the cities, because believe me, I'm studying exactly this, and if you have thousands of infantrymen entrenched into the city buildings, into the house towers, there is no army that can enter into that city, if not without a massive amount of infantry. So, relatively to the political balance within the city gates, the popular had been very strong. Now the popular was declining because the commoners didn't have anymore so many weaponry and armor. They were also growing increasingly detached from military activity that they had always loathed, but they had ended up, historically speaking, in the previous centuries to be part of, even if they didn't want to, because the fat merchants were involved in international business. They didn't give a damn about warfare. They preferred to pay someone else to fight for them. The lower classes at that point were struggling to survive in economical terms, and growing increasingly tired to the local textile industries and all, and they didn't have any time and any wealth anymore to spend for military equipment. So this opened also to another crisis that saw the rise of the soldiers of fortune into Italy, but this mostly happened in the second half of at least the major consequences of this happened in the second half of the 14th century. In the first half of the 14th century, the Italian communal armies were still a force to be reckoned with. Then eventually the mercenaries took over. But it's already into this previous period that we can observe the decline of the communal armies, and in this sense the motivation for the following the ensuing transformations. And the um, the social differences were definitely growing. There was an increasingly verticization of society, which, in telling the truth, also produced certain. It was positive in a certain sense, because having a more centralized government actually brings to a more stable form of government, a more centralized, a more efficient. The the European modern state is born in this sense conceptually into these Italian city-states. Um, Often the ruling classes also tended to actively disarm the citizenry, which is also interesting, telling the truth. So there are really many factors that intervene into this sense, as you understand. Um, so this situation could be managed. I tried it. I tried to make it catastrophic, but really the world passage was much smoother than you can imagine. Probably at the time, in in one or two generations, they understood that things had changed. But it wasn't something so radical. I mean, there is not really a moment into which you can see that a city basically turns into this direction. There are major political and military events that, for the singular cities, really marked a bit of a watershed, especially the great popular defeats in open field marked the call for lords to manage the situation. So you can see maybe in those moments if anything, an acceleration of the phenomenon, but also in there that there was a lot of back and forth. So it's really progressive. But let's say that the tendency structurally is the one we have explained. And initially, the commune could really manage the situation if it was wealthy enough, if the popular classes were overall still cohese enough. But as we were saying, during the course of the 14th century, things got increasingly rough, especially for the continental economical crisis. Um, and and here, as we've said, also we have the necessity of entrusting to a singular leader the political military affairs, because the clashes between the popular parties couldn't be stopped. Um, and these same parts agreed that, at least initially for a short period of time, um, the absolute power had the so-called balia in Italian had to be entrusted to a singular character that we call as lord. That really has tens of ways that the Italians called it, like at the time. But that could represent order. This is something you find in history, like take into the Roman history. There was the dictator, the dictator in practice, that to whom were entrusted for a short time in times of extreme danger, of extreme crisis and emergency, the full political and military power in practice. So this was an emergential measure that you find basically in every society. I mean, it's as if today, I don't know, that there was a major catastrophe in the world, and in a certain country, and the state intervenes the hard way, with iron fist, like with armed forces and all, to represent the social order. And in times of crisis, there is the need of such a leader. It's not a surprise, and this doesn't mean to justify the process, because this is actually, if you look at how totalitarianism rose, take fascism or communism, or these regimes actually rose always in disastered situations. Take Italy after World War the First, or Russia after the revolution, and the loss of the war. Take the Weimar Republic in post World War I Germany. I mean, there were times of great weakness, of great division, of great uncertainty, and that's why the people basically elected even, dependingly, because the communists weren't elected, they just took power and slaughtered all the opposers. But if you take Nazi Germany, or Hitler was de facto elected, democratically speaking. The Italians definitely entrusted power to Mussolini, and they confirmed his power. So it's very fascinating to see how very terrible regimes actually have a do not impose. Actually, there is this narrative that the terrible dictator imposed on our freedoms. No, it is you most likely who was willing to hand him over those freedoms. And so we should learn from the past. And even if you look at communal Italy, it was a very less dramatic thing as we imagined, because these Italian laws were all but totalitarian leaders. They still had a weak power themselves in a certain measure, but they were tending towards forms of monarchy in practice, because even if the Italians didn't accept anything like the monarchy, also because that would have been impossible in the institutional frame of Europe and of the Holy Roman Empire, into which the Italians always, by the way, thought themselves to be in. The fact that the Italians fought so harshly against the empire during the 12th and 13th century doesn't mean that they were fighting actively against the imperial institutions. They were fighting against strangers entering their own business, and they still obeyed to the emperor. Actually, the Italians at this time are creating humanism and the Renaissance, and they are actually on the lead in terms of theoretical, in terms of political theory. From an intellectual point of view, they back imperial prerogatives. There is all a juridical system around which the empire as an institution is justified. So there couldn't be a king in there, but there could be a ruler, someone that was actively chosen by the free people of the commune to rule on their behalf, substantially, because this was really the thing. And in fact, the Italian laws actually never cancelled the communal institutions. It's not that communes ended at this time. The communes went on, arguably forever, in the sense that all over Italian history, the communes had certain political and juridical prerogatives to the local government, independently from how how power they practically they proportionally had in comparison to the upper institutions. So there is a lot of ambiguity even in spotting who was a real lord, and we can't really figure out clearly even at the beginning, because there had always been a sort of ruling class, or ruling families at a certain point. But the important thing is that these measures, these emergential measures, allowed to surpass certain impasses that, without modifying the communal institutions by themselves. So without reforming the laws that these communities had usually fought for centuries, but simply saying, okay, we call you as a lord, but as long as you defend us from our enemies, but in turn you maintain our you obey to our laws. You do not abolish our our rights in theory at least. And so in this, the so-called signoria, so the seigniory in Italian, was coming from below, was coming from the people, and it was configured as a sort of dictatorship, as we have seen, to deal with a situation of emergency. The Signories really didn't start in Italy at the same place and at the same time, really, because the first area into which the Signories spread was Lombardy, which is kind of fascinating because Lombardy actually had been the most active um, region against the struggles against the Hohenstaufen, but for certain peculiar characteristics that we can't fully discuss now, had grown, let's say, more in need of this, especially super citizen regimes. At the beginning, very soft, and then, you know, deeper and more deeply rooted over a specific city. It kind of began around the 40s of the 13th century, and then eventually structured itself, especially during the second half of the 13th century. Think about the Della Torre and eventually the Visconti in Milan. There are some of the most important seigneuries and some of the most powerful ones. Um, in the rest of the Po Valley, you find the Gonzaga in Mantua that rose actually at the beginning in the 20s of, if I'm not wrong, in 1329. The Este in Ferrara that instead were ruling since a much ancient time as a local noble family that eventually the same Ferrarese commune basically adopted as permanent lords. This happened because Ferrara was an extremely developed popular commune, so these feudal lords had a greater grip on the political and social asset. Also in the region of Veneto, in the northeast of Italy, that was a much more feudal area in this sense that it kind of it's more explainable. If you take the Della Scala, for instance, in Verona, that was an area that was much more resemblant of there were a lot of feudal lords. It looked a bit like more Piedmont, certain parts of the Germanic world than of Italy. The Da Carrara in Padua. Padua was a very strong popular commune, and yet it saw the rise of seigneuries as well, chiefly because of the wars against the Della Scala that showed that even if Padua was a much larger city than Verona, it still suffered enormous defeats against the Della Scala and the Veronese signory, as it didn't have a seigneurial institution, practically, a seigneurial political direction. There was a spread also into central Italy, because central Italy, aside from Tuscany, was along the Apennines a pretty feudal land as well. What I'm trying to say here is that I'll say it later, just let me finish this list, so it's probably more meaningful. For instance, the Ordelaffi family in Forlì, or the Malatesta in Rimini, the da Polenta in Ravenna. These are chiefly, actually it's the Romagna region, but still close to the Marches, but the Montefeltro in Urbino, famously, they were a very long-lasting dynasty, a very important one also during the Renaissance. The Davarano in Camerino, in the full Marches, So areas where into which the popular government was relatively weaker, and there was a more widespread feudal tradition. So this really marked the rise of these seigneuries. But paradoxically, the strongest seigneuries were still the ones that were based on the most powerful cities eventually, like the Milanese Visconti, for instance. Um, which is also very interesting to point out, because it means that in those cases the citizenry actually had handed popular rights to its own prerogatives to the lords, even more willingly. Like the Milanese were extremely happy of the rise of the Visconti in a certain fashion, because they had freed them from military duties, for instance, because the military expansionism of the Visconti over the Po Valley had brought lots of money into the Milanese banks. Mm. So this is kind of understandable. Obviously, the poorer people didn't give a damn about this, like in old times, but the middle classes that, however, growing thinner but wealthier, so really becoming an oligarchy more than a popular group, were quite supportive, mm, of these seigneurial initiatives. Where instead the local lordships spread, the lordships spread least were in the city republics, in the maritime republics, and in Tuscany. The reasons for this is that the entrepreneurial classes were much active and strong, more active and stronger, and therefore it was more difficult for a single group, a single family, single ruler to reach the primacy over, and to impose a dictatorial solution over the citizenry. If you take cities like Genoa or Venice, you understand that there was a pretty strong oligarchy that, in spite of its differences, was forming essentially a body of a ruling class that wasn't accepting one guy or another to actually rise to the top. The same happened in Florence. That was not a maritime republic, but it was at this time the wealthiest city in the world for per capita, and therefore they never elected a lord in practice. They called every once in a while someone to put an end to things, but it ended very badly, usually for the guy, because he wanted to eventually extend the seigneury, but the Florentine popular classes kicked him out. And that was because the Florentine popular classes were extremely strong. So that's in spite of the impoverishment of the majority and the rise of it was really these popular oligarchs that prevented the rise of the of the lordship. And relatively to this, and this happened a bit late in time, but if you are interested, always into the medieval Italy playlist, I made a video quite some time ago that is called Freedom and Tyranny in the Age of Humanism, Political Thought in Florence and Milan, which is very interesting in this sense, because it talks about how Tuscany and Lombardy developed different political thought on the base of these differences. The Milanese were actually praising the tyranny that was really meant in the classical sense of the term, so not in the moralistic one that we use now. So the tyranny could also be a positive thing. And it actually the Milanese were actually claiming that the freedom of Italy could happen only if there was a single ruler into Italy, and this one obviously obviously had to be the Visconti in practice, which came actually pretty close in conquering the whole northern and central Italy at one point, and the Florentines were the ones who were more actively resisted against them, and that grew instead, in this sense, um, um, allergic to any form of lordship. While in Florence, in fact, republicanism mm, was being stressed as every city in Italy should be like Florence, like with all the citizens of the Republic, which really conceals an hypocrisy that is really disgusting, because first of all, in Florence, only the rich guys ruled, and all the other citizens were like depending on them unescapably. But also and especially because Florence was keeping subject many other cities, so with a form of government that really had nothing to envy to the other lordships in practice. So I'm kind of growing supportive of of lordships in a certain sense. No, I really don't care very much, but since I observed how the whole thing happened in practice, I realized that the popular classes were definitely not able to rule. I mean, their political culture was completely inadequate for Italian politics of the time, for everything that was happening in Europe, for all the interests that were present there. It is true that, I mean, yeah, if you look at Florence, if you look at Venice, you see that in spite of all the big difference that existed even between their institutions and the ones of other republican governments, we mentioned Genoa before, for instance, is that, yeah, there were popular classes that could rule, but they still were a sort of lordship. I mean, if you take the Medici, for instance, that they never claimed to be practically lords. They thought just that they had accumulated, they had been wanted by the people of Florence. As a matter of fact, they were lords in their own, and they were controlling the city like a big private dominion. So what I'm trying to say in here is that, in spite of the formal denomination of such regimes, you know, mm, the popular classes lost everything at this point, and they lost it not because they lacked the resources to um, to remain autonomous, to create democratic governments. It's simply because they had been capable when they reached power, instead of strengthening their own state and in really trying to build something more unitary. They kept fighting against each other. They still didn't want to pay money for war. It's as if they were blind, as if they didn't want to see what was happening around them, and they unavoidably ended up to be subjected to other entities, because you cannot renounce to politics. You know, this is probably a moment in history into which it's very useful to recall this, that people are growing increasingly tired of politics. There is a great, one of the reasons why populism is on the rise, and populism is a reaction. I personally don't like anything that ends in ism. So I don't like populism because I don't like anything that is has an end to itself. But populism has to be understood, at least if you want to stem it, on the grounds that there is something that doesn't work. But it doesn't work really how populism says that. It doesn't work because people do not want to acknowledge reality. They don't want to learn. They don't want to understand. They don't want to look around themselves. They just want to have their few things and say, I don't care about the rest. I want to live free out of responsibility. Mm. And this is the moment into which the mess happens, because also the Germans in the 30s didn't want to starve anymore, and they entrusted the power to a guy that slaughtered 10 million people into gas chambers, into concentration camps. Also, the Italians were tired of uh, the communist violences of poverty, and they entrusted power uh, to a guy that basically transformed the, the country uh, into a totalitarianism. Um, Also, the Russian peasants of the Tsarist Empire theoretically had wanted to be free from their masters, but they entrusted eventually they supported, or at least that they found themselves into the middle of even worse masters than the ones that they had before. Mm. The first communist policies, economical policies in Russia killed millions just because they didn't know practically how to manage a country, and those millions were people's lives, and they had to settle back into sort of an hybrid thing that was more socialist and communist in practice, with a certain degree of privatization, because otherwise the economy could have not worked. That's the same that Stalin did with Trotsky. He opposed this idea of partial privatization of industries and banks and all, and yet he had him killed in Mexico. But when he rose to power, he got his policy, because there was no other way to rule such a large thing, like the monstrous thing like the Soviet Union was. So I'd say that I'm not one of those people who says that history repeats itself in the same way, because this is also very easy thing to pretend, first of all, to know history, and secondly to say, oh yeah, this is how it's going to happen, so I can deem of being a monster everyone who disagrees with me. No, because history has never repeated itself, not even once. But let's say that there are similar dynamics, out of which indeed um, you can spot common elements, and definitely in the moment in which you entrust your rights to someone else, that can be done for good, because this is how the state is born. I mean, if you study history, you realize that without ceding part of your rights, you cannot live in a civilized world in practice. But in the moment into which you refuse to acknowledge what happens in the world, that's the moment in which you don't know what to do with your own rights, and you're unavoidably going to lose them, in my opinion. Unless there isn't someone who actively fights from a political point of view, or even military, to guard them. And there are still lots of people in the world that do not understand this, that think that it was better, when there was that dictator. Yeah, I wish you had been really lived into those times to see that, how it really was. But never think that politics is a dirty business that you don't want anything to do with, because the reason why it's dirty, it's because you let it do to someone else that abuses of the power that you give to him. Instead, if you actively participate as a citizen to your political life, if you respect your democratic institutions, other people's rights, including yours, obviously, things will work well. There's gonna be a political debate. There's gonna be arguments. There's gonna be conflict in general, because that cannot be eliminated from human society. But there is gonna be an agreement, possibly, and this is what really a civil world is supposed to be. So never entrust your rights to someone else without having the intelligence to see what that practically means. Mm. I could say more, but I'm really philosophizing at this point. I'm sorry for this. this excursus, but really, when you study this time in in history from the decline of the commune and the rise of seigneuries, you realize that there is something that doesn't work not much on a structural level, but really on an idea level. I mean, there is someone that actively chose for things to go in such a fashion. Mm. It is true that the world was already unfair previously, so that these allegedly democratic communal governments were at all egalitarian, were at all caring about the individuals and all in turn. But at the same time, these communities might have achieved something greater. There was also a lot of communal bonds and interests. I mean, they might have been formed, I don't know, a league, a confederation. After all, the Italians, when fighting against the Hohenstaufen, had joined in two leagues that had been working because there was a common good. Mm. The idea that, that if they hadn't joined together, even within previous rivals and enemies, um, uh, they might have lost their freedom. Um, well, when they won this battle, they relaxed. They lost it eventually. They lost it to certain local lordships that, however, made civilization, because you can't understand humanism or the Renaissance if you don't understand communal civilization, but also the lordship's civilization. But let's say that it was still eventually a defeat for the people, and you understand that while studying Italian history of the 14th and 15th century, that in 14th century there are still freemen, like free citizens, like notaries and lawyers, who actively wrote about their city's history and that understood everything about what was happening. Um, and then in the 15th century, you just have the chronicle that was commissioned by the local lord to by the lord to the local intelligentsia to just praise the deeds of the lordship, and nobody else could say anything. That's kind of censorship in practice. Um, and it tells you, by which degree the seigneurial power had eventually risen, and and through this process, lots of people lost not just their rights, not just their wealth, but also their life, because the lordships didn't really, you know, um, pass through a lot of. I mean, the rise of lordships didn't pass through an excessive amount of bloodshed. If anything, as we have seen, the lordship was created to stop bloodshed, and they were capable of doing that, surprisingly. But at the same time, there were people who had to be taken out to achieve this still. So conjuration, other things, and there were still lots of wars being waged. So part of the establishment of the lordships also passed through the establishment of the mercenary armies, of the soldiers of fortunes that devastated the peninsula. So there had been a price, there had been a heavy toll that these communities eventually paid for losing their freedom, let's say. So I hope I gave some insight about this, and I realize that people don't give a damn about nor Italian history nor communal history more specifically. There are just a bunch of chapters like the Romans and the Renaissance that people care about. But, well, I think that these topics are extremely important to be told, to be explained, because they're extremely useful for us today to understand. And this is something you don't have in other parts of Europe. I mean, in other parts of Europe you had only the kings, the princes, the rest of the aristocracies, and that was it. Yes, there was every city, a city every here and there, but it had never happened with like with Italy. With Italy, instead, you have a massive chapter of European medieval history into which you see the rise of city-states with an enormous wealth, enormous individual power that eventually gets banded to seigneurial rule. Um, and this is a very meaningful process, a very meaningful passage. And and it has to be observed. And it's a very beautiful history. Also, if you like military history, and you think that Italian city-states are boring because you think that that's just a bunch of merchants who create this commune and nothing else, instead you will find actually a lot of warfare. Actually, in the Italian peninsula, especially in the beginning of 14th century, but also in the 13th century, was a continuous, massive amount of war, and with massive armies. These Italians didn't have a king that could eventually pay his historiographers to tell tales about battles like, I don't know, Azincourt or Crécy or Bouvines, um, or Markfeld, or other big feudal clashes. The Italians chiefly cared only about how much that had costed to the community in terms of money. But if you study Italian warfare this time, you find that the Italians fielded armies that were often larger than the one of the most powerful feudal kingdoms of the time. They clashed continuously, and it gives you the amount of resources that these cities had. So it's very fascinating. There is a very fast rise of infantries, a very dynamic use of a very early and sophisticated use of siege machinery, crossbows. The first firearms are developed in Italy. The best technologies that you can find were there. So please do study Italian warfare of the Middle Ages because it's beautiful. I hope to discuss it soon, although I have lots of other topics I want to talk to you about, but you can find everything in the Italian in medieval Italy playlist if you have more specific tastes. For now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel. If you are interested in receiving news about my next videos. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.